Welcome back to CPAC 2023. Andy Mangione here with Rebecca Weber. We are pleased to welcome to the podcast Jan Jekielek, who is a senior editor for the Epoch Times and the host of the American Thought Leaders Show. Jan, welcome to Broadcast Row.
I'm so glad to be here. This is actually my first interview on the row, so I'm glad to start it off with you guys.
Well, we're lucky. We got you nice and fresh, Jan. Thank you for being here. There's so much I want to talk with you about. Let's start. Tell us a little bit about Epoch Times and your show, because we think that's fabulous. You've got an amazing group of guests that you've been interviewing. So let's start there. Go ahead.
Well, probably a lot of people know, but Epoch Times actually has a really interesting origin. We were started by Chinese Americans 23 years ago now. Basically, to combat Chinese Communist Party, what everyone calls now disinformation and misinformation. I just call it propaganda, right? And so you know what happened in '89, Tiananmen Square massacre. John Tong, our president, was in the student movement at the time. In '99, the Chinese regime turned against the Falun Gong. Huge persecution, huge propaganda. He's in America now. He got a scholarship to Georgia Tech. He can tell the truth. Starts a website to tell the truth about the reality of China. And this is a time when nobody in America wants to hear that. Everyone's just thinking, we got to get in there. All the money's there. If you don't get it, you won't get the Chinese market. It's almost a democracy. We're making them a democracy. All this stuff, right? And John is like, no, there's people being murdered. There's people being tortured to death. Prisoners of conscience for their faith, right? So this was the storytelling, first in Chinese, then in English, then they branched out of just the China topic. And then maybe 5-7 years ago, the English eclipsed the Chinese. We're actually in 22 languages. We're a global media. But
it's a beautiful story.
This truth-telling, right, is the centerpiece of what we've been doing all along.
It sure is. And only in America can someone flee a nation under communist control regime and make a life and improve the lives of millions of people across the globe because they're getting the truth out. We absolutely love that. I wanted you to share a little bit about your history, your story, your heritage, your family heritage. Your parents were born and raised in Poland. Is that right?
That's correct.
And they made their way here to America. I'm sure they love this country, as so many of us do. Tell us a little bit about that and how that has helped shape who you are today.
Absolutely. So they actually landed in Canada because the immigration system was kind of a bit easier for them. And that's where they ended up before I came here to the US. But, a very, very different world. My mother actually, she had gotten a job. She grew up during the war. Both the communists and the Nazis were really nasty to our families. And, she basically got this job where they gave her the offer to join the Communist Party of Poland, right? And this is an offer, if you live in a communist society, that's an offer you can't refuse because that's like untold riches, untold freedom compared to the rest of the population, control, ability to enforce your will on others. And she, because of what these systems had done to our family, she just couldn't accept. But that means now you've made a statement. Now you're saying, I'm against this, right?
What a brave
It's not a
woman.
casual decision. Yeah. Then she had to flee. So that they came in through France and ended up in Canada. And I'm very glad to have that heritage because they taught me it's very hard for people who don't grow up in a dictatorship to understand what it's like, to do the idea that there's always someone watching. There's always someone that's being paid or maybe paid, or they know they will get benefits if they inform on you, and they're expected to. And, you hear about it. That's what I heard about. We had this rule in the family, never talk about what's in the family outside of the family. That's crazy. It would have been crazy here when I was growing up. You wanted to rant about your parents or whatever, right? But actually, in that society, if the kid says the wrong thing in front of the wrong person, next thing you know, dad or mom is in the middle of the night getting picked up by a truck, and sent off to some gulag.
This is what our young people need to understand. They need to see these realities.
100%. But it's difficult to fathom. And it's actually me starting to work on the China question years ago that, I grasped it fully, what was happening. Yeah.
Wow.
It's an interesting story, Jan, and it's a fabulous story. It's an American success story is what it is. Wanted to talk a little bit about your show. And it's an impressive lineup of guests that you have had on there. Recently, you had on a guest, and this is a bold subject to be talking about, discussing how the trans industry is creating a sterilized generation. This is a really scary thought, but it's really occurring, isn't it?
Absolutely. So you're talking about Stephanie Wynn, and Stephanie Wynn's very interesting. She is a counselor, basically, who was at early on. They were taught there's a certain particular way that when people say they have some sort of questions about their, if they're a man, they wonder if they're a woman, if they're a woman or a boy, and they think they might be a girl be a boy, or something else. Right? There's a very, very specific way in the medical community that this is now approached. Okay. And what I've learned talking to people like Stephanie is that this is not actually based in medicine, it's based in ideology. And there's basically a number of organizations that have kind of masqueraded as providing medical guidance that are actually activist organizations that have this idea that basically if someone has any gender question or question about their what they call gender identity, that immediately means all other rules go out the window, and you should basically start to first, it's called socially transition them and help them to discover their so-called true self. But then the reality, right, is that, and there were people like this in the past, it was a very, very small portion of the population, people who struggled with it over years and decades, felt like they were really in the wrong body. And that's a very completely different phenomenon than what's happening now, where in groups of young girls, it actually becomes a social contagion, right? And so you have all these young girls that think, for example, they're a boy or they're non-conforming or something like this. And then there's actually medical interventions. It starts with a social intervention. Sometimes there's policies, and I've seen these, where they'll say, don't tell the parents about this because the parents might disagree, because we know that this is the correct direction, right? And then that turns into even earlier sometimes, some kind of medical intervention like a puberty blocker or a hormone or something like this. And then, we're talking about mastectomies. One guest I had on recently, Chloe Cole, when she was 13, she started being transitioned. If I recall correctly, at 15, she had a double mastectomy. Okay?
It just breaks my heart.
But now to go back to the sterilization piece, there are no long-term studies on the use of these puberty blockers, hormones, and so forth. And there's a lot of result in sterilization. So Chloe, for example, does not know if she'll ever be able to have children. No, she's what you call a detransitioner. She realized, this isn't actually what I wanted to do. And here's the really, really tragic thing. Most of these children that have these questions, right, they have other what you'd call psychological comorbidities, okay? And these psychological comorbidities, they need to be, those are the things that are treated. And I believe it's 90% of the time when those things are treated, this gender dysphoria just goes away naturally. I think it's 90% of the time.
That's the way to help young people, is to work through this, because it is not normal. It is not. And for us to try to create a society that essentially says, no, it is normal to question whether or not you were born in the right skin is dangerous. It's a dangerous, dangerous message that we're sharing with our youth. I love that you're speaking out. It's a tough discussion. It's a hard message because for me, as a Christian woman, I love all people, and I don't believe that I'm here to cast judgment on other people. But the way that we treat our society as a whole, we ought to be really looking closely at what we're doing and making real serious change and raising the alarm.
Well, the other really troubling thing is in social media, and I don't actually know how to really deal with this, aside from perhaps TikTok, which I can give you my opinion on, but there are all sorts of people, and I kind of imagine them to be kind of, almost predators, right? Like people that basically are sort of telling people that this is how they should think, this is the way it should be. There's even examples of people that say, don't worry about your family may not accept you, I will accept you. Come on my Patreon, where we can talk privately, so your parents don't have to know. I'll help you sever your relationship with your family because they don't understand you, right? And so these kinds of messages
Those
proliferate.
are characteristics of almost like a cult or a movement, a very dangerous, evil, I call it a spiritual warfare that we're seeing that's really infecting our schools, our cities, our institutions, and what concerns me as a grandparent, as a mother and a grandparent, we can't let this happen.
Well, so COVID-19, right, what it exposes, everything that's happened over the last few years, is that how easy it is for us as human beings to basically succumb to groupthink, right? And I think that around this issue is an example where there's basically a lot of groupthink. But in a lot of the rest of the world, where there was this policy of what's called gender affirming care, if a kid has questions, affirm, 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 as opposed to try to find out what's wrong with them, try to find out how to help them, right? It becomes this sort of one way. There's been lots of examples in other countries where they've stopped. For example, right now there's the biggest gender clinic in the UK is under massive lawsuits. It's being shut down because they hurt a lot of children by pushing this ideology, right? There's a simple approach, right? It's called watchful waiting. Watchful waiting when someone has this kind of dysphoria, right? I don't like to use it because I'm not even sure this is the correct terminology that should be used, right? And this is something we've discussed on my shows. But to make a long story short, you basically you can help people understand here in America that the rest of the world really doesn't treat things this way, and that why do we need to be so obsessed with this one particular goal when all these other places have realized that this is not the right way or not a good way to do it? Like, we have the
We
information
should learn
out there.
from their
100%.
failures and what we've seen. Well, thank you.
Jan, where can people find your show?
Do you know the Epoch Times website? TheEpochTimes.com. And you'll see, or EpochTV.com, EPOCHTV.com. We have actually lots of shows on Epoch TV. American Thought Leaders is one of them. It's a long form, deep discussion around issues like this, for example, or COVID, or the Chinese Communist Party threat, many issues we cover.
Jan, thank you so much for taking time to be with us on Broadcast Row. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here.